back in 2016, the Impossible Project, then at the time resurrecting Polaroid film from the grave, came out with their first I-type camera. And that first camera was kind of a fascinating mess. It was the I-1, which was built with collaboration with Teenage Engineering, which you've probably heard of. They've been in the tech media a lot lately. And this camera, well, it was interesting. It had a lot of flaws, but it was super ambitious, and I really appreciated it for that. In the years since, the Impossible Project, which became Polaroid Originals, which is now just Polaroid again, they kind of just standardized on cheaper 600 box type cameras, like the One Step 2 and the Polaroid Now, which is currently out. And you know what? That's not entirely a bad thing. Those are accessible cameras that are easy to use and really good for people who are just kind of getting into instant film photography. But as great as all of these cameras are, there wasn't really an I-type camera that made me want to replace any of my vintage Polaroid cameras. Like, they still just were the best tools for what I was shooting. Which brings us to the new I-2, which is basically Polaroid's new Pro camera. It's the highest end camera, it costs the most, and it has the most features. So how is it? Well, unfortunately, it doesn't really exist in a vacuum. There are years, decades of Polaroid cameras out there that it has to compete with, not just the other I-type cameras. Among the other I-type cameras, it's definitely the best. But among all the vintage Polaroid cameras of the world, well, it doesn't exactly make me want to turn in my other cameras just yet. And that gets us to the fatal flaw of this camera, and that is the price. This camera is $600 US. That is a ton of money. Now I get it. Building stuff's expensive, but you can get 4 of these cameras brand new for the price of one of these cameras. And the Polaroid Now Plus, it's not quite as good, but it's about 90% as good for most people. And you can buy 4 of them. You can get one of these. You can get a Polaroid SLR 680, which is the best Polaroid camera and one of the best film cameras ever made. That is what the I-2 is competing with. So for me personally, some of the things that I take into account for what camera do I want to use? What camera is going to be the best tool for me? And first of all, is an accurate viewfinder that I can see through so I could frame up the shot. Second, the camera should expose predictably. Third, kind of goes with everything else, I need the camera to waste as little film as possible. Fourth, I want to have a flash on the camera because Polaroid usually needs a flash, especially indoors, even if you have professional lighting. Finally, it helps to have a good, clear lens and autofocus that, generally hits the target. And this is the camera that knocks all of those categories out of the park. Like, this camera is amazing to use. This is an SLR based on Edwin Land's timeless design and iterated over decades, and it's just the best version of an amazing camera. You know what also kind of nails all these categories and isn't expensive at all? That's the Polaroid Impulse AF. I mean, this thing you can probably get on eBay for less than $100, and you can buy refurbished autofocus box type 600 cameras for like $200 out there, and that's like paying a premium for it. But we're getting ahead of ourselves a little bit. Let's talk about the I-2. I took a ton of photos to test this camera out, and let's see what the results were. I compared the I-2 to the Impulse AF and the SLR 680 because, like I said, in this price range, that's what they're really competing against. Like, for the I-2 to be successful in my eyes, to be something that I'm going to recommend it to people, it has to be not just equal to those cameras, but better. So one of the quirks about the I-2 is that I kind of noticed it consistently overexposed images, like with flash, without flash, and kind of in different exposure modes. It generally needed to be adjusted to like -1/3 stop or something like that, just to make sure that it wasn't too bright on subjects' faces. After I shot for the camera for a while, I compensated for that. So here in this first test, I have compensated for exposure, but that's not something I had to do with the other cameras. So here we have 3 images. We are shooting our subject with flash on a neutral gray backdrop. We have sunlight coming in from a major light source next to the model, so there is plenty of light for the camera to work with and see what it's doing. Something interesting to see in this comparison specifically is the placement of flash on the camera body. Now, vintage Polaroid cameras generally would have the flash above the lens, where the modern I-type Polaroids have always put the flash next to the lens. And I feel like the shadows on the model are much more flattering when it's above the lens. It's not the end of the world. Like, the actual nature of the flash like looks pretty consistent. I think all of the three images look great, and I think they're all equally sharp. So this I-2 is on par with the SLR 680 in sharpness, which is great. I think any color differences you may notice between these is going to be actually down to the film packs themselves. There's a bunch of stuff that impacts how Polaroid film color looks. So moving to the next image, this kind of shows the effect that exposure has on your images. So this is a challenging exposure situation. We have a black backdrop and a small dark object that's pretty close to the camera. This is a hard setup for any camera, so I really wanted to challenge what the camera did. So the Impulse AF and SLR 680 look pretty good. I think the Impulse AF does the best job. The I-2 overcompensates a little bit. It tries to expose longer to get those shadows up, to expose longer, but at the expense of the image is now blurry. This is a good spot to discuss the I-2's viewfinder. Now, the SLR 680, like the name implies, is a single lens reflex camera that allows you to actually see through the lens that you're going to be shooting with. This is the best case scenario. Other cheaper cameras like the Impulse AF and box type Polaroid cameras are usually like rangefinder style cameras where you're looking through a little lens window next to the lens you're going to be shooting with. This is just cheaper and easier to build. The I-2 is also using this rangefinder style. When you look through the window to compose your image, you're not looking through the lens that you're shooting with. The I-2 tries to compensate for this by putting little brackets around where close-up objects should be framed as opposed to far away objects, but it's hard to tell what should be framed in the close-up brackets versus what should be framed in just, the whole viewfinder, because there isn't really a clear distance where one becomes the other. And in these images, you can see I tried to get everything in center of frame, but with the I-2, I didn't exactly hit it. Now with a few tries, I probably could figure it out, but Polaroid film's expensive. This camera does have a lot of manual control on it, and what I like is that you don't need to rely on a separate app to do it. There's a little screen on the back here, and when you turn the camera on, you can use the screen to go between the different modes, the aperture, shutter, priority, manual. You can even do multiple exposures. You have timers, and you just use the little ring up here to go through modes and adjust things. There is exposure compensation at the top, which is great to have that on the camera. Like I said, the exposure is pretty consistently overexposing for me, so it's easy just to notch it a little bit down and forget about it. One pet peeve I have with this exposure thing at the top is it says -2 +2 on the other side, but then it just says 1 1. It doesn't say -1 or +1. It just says 1 on each side. So what's that all about? So one of the positive things about this camera is that with the aperture priority control, you can actually make sure that you can get shallow depth of field even with the flash on. With my SLR 680, when I have the flash on, it tends to go to a different aperture that's going to have less shallow depth of field, whereas this, I can kind of force that shallow depth of field even while using flash, which is awesome. Overall build quality is fine. I mean, it's nice enough. It's plastic. It's a plastic box type camera, so it doesn't really compare to the SLR 680's premium materials. So one of the other things I want to talk about is the battery situation. So Polaroid cameras, historically, like the old 600 and SX70 type cameras, each of those film cartridges contain a little battery, and that's what ran the camera. Well, that's a little wasteful, so I think it's a good thing that modern day I-type cameras is basically using the same film as 600, but it's removing that battery and letting the camera itself, power everything through a rechargeable battery, which is great. The problem is that rechargeable lithium-ion batteries have a shelf life. They don't last forever. And if you don't charge it on a regular basis, they last even less time. I'm not upset that there's rechargeable batteries in this camera, but those rechargeable batteries are not easily accessible. I think it would be really important for the user to be able to get in there and swap that battery out. And it seems like a weird thing to worry about, but Polaroid cameras are cameras that are used for decades. And already my i1 barely holds a charge because I don't charge it all the time. It sits in a drawer a lot because, it's not one of my go-to cameras. And that's the fate of all I-type cameras. And I really don't want these things to become e-waste. Like, I know if the film gets discontinued, if Polaroid disappears again, like, the cameras are dead, so who cares? But I hope that doesn't happen. And, you know, already we're seeing the consequences of that. So, Polaroid, if you're listening, please make it easy to replace these batteries. So this review has gone super long, but there's a lot to talk about with this camera. I mean, it's an ambitious effort. I want to cheer Polaroid on. I want this camera to succeed, but at $600, it really can't justify its price tag. Like, it doesn't exist in a vacuum. And for most of what people are using Polaroid for, they're going to be better off either spending less on the camera and more on the film with, you know, like the Polaroid Now, or just getting a vintage Polaroid camera, because those cameras are great. Like, and it makes me wonder, you know, the Impossible Project was its own thing for a long time, but it merged with Polaroid. It now has theoretically the same IP that Polaroid has. So what's stopping the Impossible Project from making an I-type SLR Polaroid camera? Like, I would pay so much money to get a brand new I-type camera. And theoretically, they should have Edwin Land's patents for that, right? But anyways, enough dreaming. The Polaroid I-2, I'm sorry, the $600 is just too much. Like, you just can't get around that price tag because it's just so much. Like, there's like that saying where there's no bad products, just bad prices, and this is definitely a victim of that. I think that this camera would be amazing if it was like $250, where it's like a jump from the 150 Polaroid Now Plus, but not like a multiples of 4 jump. But I guess we'll just have to wait and see what the i3 has in store. I don't get review units, and I have to pay for all this stuff out of my own pocket. So if you enjoyed this video, give it a like, subscribe, all that, super helpful. And in the meantime, happy shooting.